San Francisco District Attorney Chesa Boudin is our final panelist. He was elected in November 2019 on a progressive platform centered on ending mass incarceration, protecting crime survivors, and addressing the root causes of crime. District Attorney Boudin personally understands the impact of incarceration. Both of his parents were incarcerated throughout his childhood, and his father is still in prison. I give you District Attorney Chesa Boudin.
Thank you so much, Kathy, and thank you to our Revolution East Bay for bringing us together to talk about such critical issues. It's always an honor to speak alongside Professor Armour and with my friend Pamela Price. Great to see both of you, always inspirational to listen to your words and hear you speak truth about this system that has so shaped my life and tragically come to be a defining part of modern American culture. Let me take a step back and talk a little bit about how we got here, about the work that we've been doing in my office and where we're going as a country with this movement to radically rethink and re-envision our approach to crime and public safety and rehabilitation and restoration. You look at the history of crime and punishment in this country, it is tied in many ways inextricably to race and social control of people of color. You look at the rise of police departments way back in the day, and many of those police departments were privately funded to protect the wealth of the few against the needs of the many. And if you look at the expansion of criminal codes, it coincides throughout history with virtually every single moment when we've seen a mass uprising of people of color or otherwise socially excluded and oppressed people, whether it be the transition from slavery. And there are books, look, there are books that track this history brilliantly. Angela Davis has written about it. Michelle Alexander has written about it. You can read about it in Professor Armour's book. These histories are well documented. Now, I'm not going to go through all the details now, but suffice it to say, there is a line that you can follow easily and clearly from slavery all the way up until mass incarceration, what we see today. It is not an accident. It is not a coincidence that our jails and prisons from coast to coast are disproportionately filled with young men of color. Young men who could be getting their educations, who could be starting businesses, who could be raising families, right? But instead we have them in cages. Well, the way we got here, right? I mean, you can look at the growth. Pam was talking about the percentages of overcrowding in California prisons, for example. That wasn't true in the 1960s or the 1950s, right? It took off. The growth of our prison system in California and across the country took off at almost exactly the same time as the federal government and the state government and the local government was looking desperately for a mechanism to respond with force and with social control to the righteous rage that was being manifested in the form of the Black Panther Party and the American Indian movement and all of the Brown Berets, all of the other groups of communities that had been historically disenfranchised and excluded economically and socially, red zoned out of housing opportunities and denied educational opportunities. Those groups that started to organize themselves politically in the 1960s and 70s, when the status quo, when the Republicans, when the law enforcement operatives saw what was happening, they said, we need a way to push back. And the way that they did it was with mass incarceration. And you see, if you look at a chart, I don't have a PowerPoint prepared for you, but if you look at a chart, you will see a line that goes like this, straight up, starting in the early 1980s. And there's a book by a man named Christian Parenti called Lockdown America, which you can read. He has the quotes from Nixon and Reagan and their administration saying, this is a great way for us to control these communities that are demanding their fair share, their voice in the political process. And that's when the war on drugs starts. That's when the war on drugs starts. And that's when we see people going to prison, not just for violent crimes, and look, let's be clear. Violent crimes in this country are punished in ways that are absolutely inhumane. Violent crimes are punished in ways that no other civilized country in the history of the world chooses to punish people for, right? But we also saw this explosive growth. And I'll tell you, some of the people that were in prison with my mom and my dad for decades were there for drugs. for possession of drugs with intent to distribute, decades. And in a minute, I'm gonna talk about the work we're doing to unwind and to reimagine and reinvent our approach to public safety. But I want to point out something really important. As folks like myself or George Gascon or Larry Krasner or Rachel Rollins or Kim Fox or any of these other folks around the country who are part of our national movement to radically re-envision criminal justice, as we start to do things differently. And when I say different, let me be really clear about what I mean. The status quo approach is, let's send people away for as long as possible every chance we get. Let's max them out. Let's seek the maximum punishment, the death penalty, life without parole, 25 to life for a purse snatching, you name it. That is the status quo approach. That is what led us to mass incarceration. That is what led not just to my parents being incarcerated. My parents participated in a very serious crime. 3 men were killed. But my parents are not the average prisoner, right? The average prisoner is there for something in which nobody got physically hurt. That's the average prisoner serving decades. We as a society have been willing to spend $80,000, $90,000 a year to incarcerate people. Where is that investment in communities, in education, in healthcare, in job training, right? We know what builds safe communities. It's prevention, right? Instead, we wait for people to do something wrong and then we hit them as hard as we can. And we set them up to fail again and again and to make sure they can't. You can't be a barber if you have a felony conviction in California. You can't be a firefighter if you have a felony conviction in California. You can't get any kind of jobs or educational loans or any of the things you need to do right. And then we wonder why we have recidivism rates at which people are released from custody and reincarcerated across the country that are above 2/3. It's a revolving door and it's set up to be that way. Less than 2% of the entire multi-billion-dollar budget of the Department of Corrections in the state of California, less than 2% goes to rehabilitative programs. We're not trying to rehabilitate people, we're trying to warehouse them. And it's no wonder that it hasn't worked to make us safer. But nobody ever said to those traditional tough on crime prosecutors, show us the data, show us the empirical evidence that this approach works, right? In other words, if we're going to invest hundreds of billions of dollars in a war on drugs, which we have in this country, fumigating peasant crops in Colombia and Ecuador and Peru, right? Policing, dogs getting trained to sniff, building jails and prisons, training correctional officers, expanding and militarizing our police forces so that they can over-police poor Black and brown neighborhoods. And by the way, I went to Yale College and Yale Law School, and you didn't see the police kicking down doors in the dorm room when people were using illegal drugs, right? They were on the other side of the city making arrests in Black and brown neighborhoods for drugs, right? We have a total double standard when it comes to enforcement of these laws, right? But nobody ever said, well, show us the evidence, the data that putting someone in a cage for possessing small amounts of organic plant material like marijuana is an effective way to achieve any legitimate government interest. I mean, let's talk about what those interests might be. You might say, well, people harm themselves when they use drugs. They overdose, they die, right? We want to prevent people from using drugs. Okay, show me the evidence that putting people in cages makes it less likely that other people are going to use drugs. Because I haven't seen any evidence of that. Okay, you might say, well, this is illegal, it's a crime, they're not paying taxes on their money, and the government wants to tax all economic activity. Okay, show me the evidence that the war on drugs has decreased the number of people selling drugs. You might say, well, we want to drive the price up so it's harder for people to get addicted in the first place. Show me the evidence that the war on drugs has made access to drugs or the cost of drugs more difficult. It doesn't exist. And nobody ever asked those tough on crime prosecutors, those drug warriors, to come up with empirical evidence. Now you have people like me and Larry Krasner and others we've mentioned around the country saying, wait a second, this approach, this use of resources is backwards. We need to put the money up front in our communities. We need to put victims at the center of the process and invest in healing crime victims and supporting people who've been harmed, not simply use them as pieces of evidence that we drag into court and compel in many cases to give testimony, even if they don't want to. We need to start thinking about restorative justice, which is a victim-centered, victim-driven approach to responding to crime and to healing people who've been harmed and to holding those that cause the harm accountable. And all of a sudden, everybody wants data. All of a sudden, people say, well, let me see that this works. And let me be clear, we're going to show them that it works. We've got the data. We've been doing restorative justice in San Francisco's juvenile system for 5 years now, and over 90% of victims contacted say that's what they prefer. They prefer a restorative justice approach to an approach that just sends a kid to a warehouse for X number of years, right? Puts them in cages. That's what victims want. And it's not just that it's what victims want. It's that it's what makes us safer as a community. The recidivism rate, the rate at which these young people are rearrested when they go through a restorative justice process instead of a traditional lock them up and throw away the key process, is drastically lower. It's drastically lower. In other words, people are set up to succeed when we hold them accountable instead of simply punishing them. It's a huge difference. Our system does a great job of punishing people. It does a terrible job of holding them accountable. Now, I want to talk briefly about a couple of the things we've been able to do in San Francisco in the year since I got elected, because these are things that I campaigned on. These are things that our revolution and Senator Bernie Sanders endorsed me and helped me win my election because of my commitment to do. And I am really proud to say that despite historic obstacles like COVID-19, the Black Lives Matter social justice uprising this summer, all of the things that really rose up in 2020 in a way we never could have anticipated, right? Shutting down our courts, changing crime trends, devastating local government budgets, we've still been able to push forward and make changes that are long overdue. So let me give you a few of the things we've done. I ran my campaign with a central commitment that we would end mass incarceration, that we would cease to use jails and prisons as a primary response to all of the social problems we see, right? That it would be a last resort rather than a first resort. And I'm proud to tell you that in just a year in office, we have decreased the number of people in California Department of Corrections out of San Francisco County, right? The people that my office is responsible for, by over 25%. I'm proud to tell you that our county jail, it's not just that we're holding them all in the jail. It's not just that we're holding them all in the jail. Our county jail population in San Francisco fell from its peak in the month after I took office to its lowest point. It fell by over 45%, right? We've drastically decreased our jail and prison population. And a lot of people, right, the fear mongers, the folks who want to focus on the crimes that do happen, because we live in a society with crime, with inequality, with access to weapons, with trauma, right, with untreated mental illness and addiction. We know that. We know there's going to be crime. And the fear mongers will tell you, well, if you let them out of the jail, if you let them out of the prison, what's going to happen? Crime's going to go way up. Well, we saw the opposite happen in San Francisco this year. We saw crime in my first year in office fall by 23% compared to the prior year. And a lot of people will tell you, well, that's because of the pandemic. And that's true. I'm not taking credit for it. I want to be clear. I know the pandemic changed everything about our daily lives, including crime trends. But what I also know is we showed in 2020 that we can safely decarcerate, that we can reduce our expensive, inhumane reliance on putting human beings in cages and focus resources on successful reentry, on community-based services and programming, and on effective prevention and deterrence. And we can do it in a way that is consistent with our values as progressives in San Francisco and the Bay Area. We can do it in a way that's consistent with our values of members of our revolution, of people who supported Senator Bernie Sanders, and of people who understand that hurt people. And when we heal the hurt, we're all safer as a result. And that's where we should be focusing our resources. We should get the vindictive and punitive aspects of our system out, focus on accountability and equal enforcement of the law. So let me tell you a couple other things we did, and then I'll wrap up because I know folks have questions and I've been talking a long time. We ended money bail. Let me tell you what money bail is. Money bail is a wealth-based system for keeping people incarcerated, even when they haven't been convicted of a crime, simply because they are too poor to come up with a cash payment. It means wealthy people, no matter how dangerous they are, get released from custody immediately, and poor people, no matter how low risk they may be, no matter how petty the crime they were arrested for is, languish behind bars simply because of their poverty. Well, we replace that wealth-based system with a risk-based system. It gives meaning to the promise of equal protection under law, and it promotes public safety for all of us. We also ended the racist use of the kind of sentencing enhancements that Professor Armour was talking about that were commonplace across the state, huge drivers of racial disparities in sentencing, and of mass incarceration. We just said we're not going to use 3 strikes or racist gang enhancements. And we also said we're not going to be complicit in policing that amounts to driving while black or brown, right? We've heard about that. We know anybody on this call who's black or brown, you've been stopped. You've been stopped just because of the way you look. I see people nodding your heads. I see you. That's not right. That is not right. We should not live in a society where our law enforcement officials with a badge and a gun and a uniform are stopping people while they're driving down the street simply because of the color of their skin, and yet it happens every day in every city across the country. Well, I said, not on my watch. I will not be complicit. The district attorney's office will not be complicit with this massive, decades-long, systematic civil rights violation that undermines trust between communities of color and the law enforcement agencies that have sworn to serve and protect those same communities. And so we implemented a policy, and I'm proud to say Professor Armour was there with me when we announced it back in February, a year ago. He was there with me when we announced it at Manny's in the Mission in San Francisco, where we said, if police officers stop someone for driving while black or brown, if it's a pretextual traffic stop, we will not file contraband criminal charges stemming from those stops and searches. We're going to push the police department to live up to the values and the standards that we all deserve and expect from them. And that means equal enforcement when police break the law too. And that's why we filed on my watch the first ever homicide charges against a San Francisco police department officer who was on duty and shot and killed an unarmed black man. His name was Cato O'Neill. His name was Cato O'Neill. And it happened 3 years before I was elected, but we filed the case, and it's one of 3 cases we filed since I took office against police officers. I want to be clear, I don't have anything against police officers. I have tremendous respect for the hard work that men and women in the police force do every day. It is a difficult job. Is a very difficult job. And we depend on police for a lot of critical public safety functions. But I also want to be clear, for far too long, police have operated with total impunity and without any transparency. And it is high time that we have district attorneys who are willing to enforce the law equally. And that means if we see someone commit a crime, whether it's a police officer, whether it's a random person walking down the street, we need to approach it the same way. We need to hold police to a high standard. We give them tremendous power and authority. We give them tremendous trust and responsibility. And it means if they violate that trust, if they use force unlawfully, we will hold them accountable. Now, there's a lot of folks that don't like that. A lot of folks in the police unions that don't like being held accountable. A lot of folks in the tough on crime media circles that don't like that. And so what they do is they look at any example of a crime, of a tragedy that occurred. And we've had some in San Francisco. Of course, we've had some. This is a tragic year. People are living in isolation and desperation, and economic opportunities have evaporated overnight for so many folks who've lost their jobs and their homes and their shelter beds. So of course, there have been violent crimes this year. And what they do is they try to exploit those tragedies and use them as opportunities to fearmonger, to blow racist dog whistles, to bring out tropes like Willie Horton, like Professor Armour talked about, and to roll back criminal justice reforms rooted in data, in empirical evidence, and in racial justice. But our movement is too strong for that. Our confidence and our commitment to our values and to our principles of equal enforcement of the law and racial justice are way too deeply ingrained in our bones to fall prey to the kinds of lies and fear-mongering that we see coming out of some of these places every day. We will not fall, we will not falter, and we will not stop in our pursuit for a more just, equitable, and efficient approach to the problems like drug addiction and mental health and trauma that are at the root of so many crimes that get committed. We know we can do better, and we will do better together because our movement is growing, and it's growing every day. Thank you so much for your support, for your work, for your vision, for your leadership, and for having the backs of all the folks out there on the front lines doing the difficult work to reinvent and reimagine our approach to public safety. Thank you.
Wow, that was great. That was the end of our speaker section of the talk, and there was so much knowledge dropped. I don't know how many questions everyone has. I have like 4 or 5 myself. And also that stat about $90,000 per year per prisoner. Isn't Stanford like $30,000? Like, Oh, it looks like you're muted. Yeah.
Yeah, it depends which department. I think Stanford's raised its prices, but it is definitely cheaper to send someone to Stanford or Harvard or Yale or Cal than it is to hold them in a cage. And the problem is we're only willing to spend the money after they get arrested for a crime. We're not willing to invest that money up front in education and job training.
Yeah, and we don't have to send someone to Stanford for 25 years.
That's right. That's right.
4 to 8 is great. Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and get on with the Q&A panel section of the talk.